those in favor? That passes 8-0. 2.03 to bus driving MOA. Can I have somebody move that to the table, please? Moved by Mr. Butler, seconded by Mrs. Farmer. Any comments, questions, concerns on that? Seeing none, all those in favor? That passes 8-0. Moving on to the gas and building administrator MOA. Can I have somebody move that to the table, please? Moved by Vice President Moore, seconded by Dr. Trawick. Any comments, questions, concerns on that? Seeing none, all those in favor? That passes 8-0. Moving on to the Code of Conduct update, Superintendent Groutman.
Oh, 2.0.
Oh, the field trip, sorry. Can I have somebody move the 2.05 field trips MOA for the field trip coordinator, please? Moved by Mrs. Farmer, seconded by Mrs. Flores. Any comments, questions, concerns on that? Seeing none, all those in favor? That passes 8-0. Moving on to the Code of Conduct presentation, Superintendent Groutman.
Yeah, this is an update. I'm going to invite Dr. Zaffitz and Dr. Baker to come on back up. Just as a reminder, we presented the Code of Conduct back in July, like we do annually, where you all were able to share with us changes and recommendations going forward. There's been a public hearing, and this is just a final update to sort of close the loop before it gets voted on by the board this evening. So thank you for being here and for giving us the update.
Yeah, absolutely. The only thing I'll add before turning over to Dr. Baker is that for this update, we just took into consideration some of the comments that were made at the end of the last meeting and some of the work that's going to be happening for next year, a little kind of breadcrumb. So I'll turn it over to Christine to take us through the presentation.
Good evening, everybody. So I won't spend as much time because we went over most of the information that's in here. So just as a reminder why we have a code of conduct, it's just a general guide around good citizenship and tools to understand the norms of behavior and make sure we're clear on the expectations around behavior. So for the 22-23 school year, we had a separate implementation committee that included representatives from every single building. That was a teacher and a GASA representative, specifically the principal. And we really went through the entire document and unpacked that document. So that was something we have never done before, but it ensured that we had reps from every single building to really understand what was in that document. I say that because a lot of the feedback that you all shared last year, but also previous years, was consistency in implementation. And so we really hope that this new structure will help to just sort of take that document, because what's on paper is really sometimes difficult to put into practice in terms of consistency. There's a ton of variables to put in place, but we still hope to get closer to being more consistent as a district and at least examining the reasons why or why not we aren't. So that was at least a first start with getting to a point of implementation with more consistency throughout our system and increased awareness and understanding, because we were able to uncover that a lot of teachers were really unclear of what was in the document. So it really helped us to expand awareness. Then we also had our business meeting, which consisted of our board, of a couple board member representation, district and building administrators, teachers, mental health staff, students, and parents. And that was for more of the formal look of, after we looked at the code of conduct, what were the implications where we need to actually change and update the document. So I'm going to go over, again, some of those changes that we did make as a business committee. So we made sure that there was alignment and more clarity in definitions. So for example, the word persistent appeared a few times when it came to persistent behavior. So we added some definitions around what persistent meant, and we talked about that as an implementation committee and also the business portion of a committee. So that's one example of being really clear on when persistent behaviors happen, what does that mean, what do we mean by persistent, and how can we make sure we're more consistent in that area. We also added a visual to help with increased understanding of restorative practices. There was already a section in there on restorative practices, but really helping to understand this visual around high support and high accountability, that it really isn't, there's a misconception around restorative practices having less accountability, and so we wanted to make sure that that was there to help increase that understanding. And we know, so we have some more professional learning and follow-up to do to really understand what the structures of restorative practices means and looks like. And so we have some action steps for next year to do that. The other point that we made with the implementation committee was really understanding the difference between minor level behaviors and major behaviors. There was a lot of inconsistency and lack of awareness around level 1 behaviors and what that meant for teachers versus an administrative response for major behaviors. And so we spent a lot of time with teachers unpacking that together, and we had some changes within Infinite Campus and the Code of Conduct to reflect those discussions. And so we hope that that will lead to more consistency in practices, because now we all feel like we're better set up to be on the same page with actually living those sections of the Code of Conduct. We also updated with our attorney's input around the Students with Disabilities section, just to be updated with new legislation and compliance. And then we also spent a good chunk of the business meeting updating the visitor section that was outdated and making it more explicit that we need to make an appointment when a visitor comes in, that parents and other visitors can't just enter a classroom at any time. We need to make sure there's an appointment for the confidentiality of teachers and students in those classrooms. We also reorganized an abridged version, so that was for readability and to really break down the large document of the Code of Conduct into more concrete, simplistic terms for students and families. And so those, we got a lot of parent input on to make sure that it's understandable and makes sense in terms of the gist of what's in that larger document. We also made adjustments to student searches and making sure we clarified that parents aren't always notified before a search for safety purposes, but they will always be contacted afterwards of the outcome. So as far as next steps, the abridged Code of Conduct has been sent to families in the welcome back information and in communication out. There's going to be a common presentation on the Code of Conduct for staff and also the online referral system that we're utilizing for this upcoming school year. There's no longer the paper-based system for most of the referrals. They're all input right into Infinite Campus. And there also will be common presentations for all secondary students on expectations around the Code of Conduct, not just clarity of norms, but also clarity on how to get support if they're struggling with something. So instead of, engaging in a verbal altercation in the hallway, how might you get support with a conflict instead of engaging in that verbal conflict? We also will be expanding the pilot for the Peer Accountability Council to Olympia, and so that's there's a lot of plans for that, and we'll keep everyone updated on those developments. And then we also had restorative student trainings. So we had 3 full days with Odyssey students and Olympia students that came together for peer mediation training to become teen jurors for our PAC, our Peer Accountability Council, and to facilitate Tier 1 circles, community circles within the classroom. And so that hope is just a start of involving more students in these processes and to really help us move restorative practices at the secondary level and getting students involved in this. We know that with a little bit that we've done at Arcadia Middle with peer mediation, that we've seen a lot of potential in that system, and so we hope to update you regularly on some of those systems that are developing in those schools, and so we're excited about some of the next steps to bring some of the systems of restorative practices to life. So some next steps, the committee for next year is going to continue to involve input from multiple stakeholders around areas that we want to focus in, but we want to ground the committee more into data. We provide a Board of Education update for you all around suspensions and behavior referrals, and we hope to use this committee to actually dive into some of that data, to use maybe some case studies or scenario works to try to help with examining some of the reasons why these behaviors are happening or consistencies, and have that be a potential focus of like where we might want to better understand why there was a discrepancy in managing the behavior one way or another, and some of the, and getting more information around that. So that might lead to talking to more staff or families or students in a particular area, and it might uncover some other areas we need to focus on. And we also want to update the committee on restorative practices and the various pilots that we have going at Arcadia, Middle, Odyssey, and Olympia. And just trying to make sure I'm not forgetting anything. But basically, this is in the spirit of consistency and implementation. That we want to, the last time I presented, we talked about how are we going to know that the implementation committee and involving everyone really had an impact? And I think looking at data and examining that in that way will really help to say, are there other changes that we need in the actual document, or is this more about communication and consistency with stakeholders to better understand what might be happening? All right, and that's all I have for you all.
Thank you. Moving on to 5.01, change orders. Can I start move the change orders to the table, please? Moved by Ms. Farrar, seconded by Mr. Butler. Any comments, questions, or concerns on the change orders? I have 3 questions, one on each one. In the first one, are we going to go back on the construction?
Which one is that?
The Hewitt Young Electrical, the very first one, it's, what's the number? EC 064?
The 150,000?
No, the 24,609.82. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, understood.
Are we going back after the construction document, because it says there was an error in the construction document? Was it our error, or was it?
No, there was an error on the construction documents, but it was a value-added change. So
Okay,
my understanding is the lights were hung by just rods, which make them
wiggly.
susceptible to swinging. We changed it, asked for a change in the design to make it more of a steel beam, so that if balls hit the lights, they don't break.
Okay, perfect. And then on this, the $150,000 one you referenced, is the $10,000 that they're gonna contribute back, is that reasonable? Or should it have
Yes.
been more? Okay,
We would have liked to have seen it higher. I think we were asking for 25, but they came back at 10. Part of the industry standard, I say, well, this is, you know, had it been on the construction documents, we would have paid for it anyways. We're just
Okay.
paying more because it's a change order. So they kind of held that line of thinking, and we settled it.
and then on the last one, the, PC 025R, the $18,000 one, just so I'm reading it right, that 18,000 takes care of everything.
Yes,
Okay, awesome.
I had to get there. I had to get an explanation on that one as well.
Okay, those change orders amount to $193,025. Does anybody else have any questions or comments on them? Seeing none, all is in favor? That passes 8-0. The 6.01 tax certiorari claims. Does anybody have any questions on those? It's written information only, all righty. The consent agenda, can I have somebody move the consent agenda to the table, please? Moved by Vice President Malloy, seconded by Mrs. Farrar. Any comments, questions, or concerns on the consent agenda? Seeing none, all is in favor? That passes 8-0. 8.01, a district-wide safety plan approval. Can I have somebody move that to the table, please? Moved by Ms. Farmer, seconded by Dr. Trawick. Any comments, questions, or concerns on that? Seeing none, all is in favor? That passes 8-0. Moving on to the building safety plan approvals. You reviewed those in executive session last week. Does anybody have any questions that we can answer out here, or nobody has any questions? Perfect. With that, can I get a motion? Moved by Mr. Butler, seconded by Mrs. Flores. All those in favor? That passes 8-0. Moving on to the district safety committee members' approval. Can I have somebody move that to the table, please? Moved by Mrs. Farmer, seconded by Ms. Farah. Any comments, questions, or concerns on those? Seeing none, all those in favor? That passes 8-0. Can I have somebody move the Greece School District, the Greece Central School District approves the 23-24 targeted schools improvement plans for the following schools: Lakeshore Elementary School, Arcadia Middle School, and Olympia, and the 23-24 district comprehensive improvement plans as presented. Can I have somebody move those to the table, please? Moved by Dr. Trawick, seconded by Mrs. Flores. Any comments, questions, or concerns on these?
These have already been submitted and approved by the state, is that right? Or submitted to the state?
It's been submitted. What was the date of?
Just the DSIP gets submitted to state
Okay.
The TSI plans are locally approved.
Can you say that again into the microphone for me, Dr. Baker? Thank you.
Just the DSIP is submitted to state ed for approval, and it was approved by the state. The TSI plans are just locally approved by district office and then submitted to the board for approval.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments or questions on those? All right, seeing none, all is in favor. That passes 8-0. Moving on to the code of conduct approval. Can I have somebody move that to the table, please? Moved by Mrs. Farmer, seconded by Mr. Butler. Any comments, questions, or concerns on this? Mr. Bonnegorio.
Thank you for the update. I know there was another update beyond the information that's been provided. I missed the first one, I apologize. I would like you to help me understand, the paper referral process is going away, being replaced by a digital process. Will that allow teachers and staff who submit referrals to keep track of what the status is on those? You know, there's been in the past some lack of knowledge of the progress in some instances.
Yeah, there'll be we actually just met on this today. There'll be a notification for teachers that do submit referrals when the issue is resolved by administration. So they'll submit the referral, and then they'll receive an electronic notice that the issue was resolved by administration.
So that'll happen after the situation is resolved? They won't have any intermediate process, what it's leading to input or anything like that?
So the teacher completes the referral when the infraction happens, and then the administration, investigates, applies appropriate intervention or consequence, and then resolves the referral in the system, and then the teacher will get notified at that point.
Thank you.
Ms. Farah.
Thank you. I just want to piggyback off of Mark's question. What's the turnaround time for a teacher to get the referral in and then it being processed so the teacher knows what consequences or such infraction that the student is going to get? Because we heard actually, a couple people spoke about this at Resident Forum. So the lead time or the lack of time frame, do we have a accountability purpose as far as the administrators as well, when the teachers are going to get that information back?
Well, most behavior incidents are really kind of situation specific. So depending on what happens and all of the context that surrounds that, it could impact, I guess, the turnaround time. We try to resolve everything as soon as possible. I think this system will really help with kind of the loop of feedback to get the resolution back to the teacher without having to have an individual conversation for every referral that's written. But as far as like a 24-hour window or something like that, it's not that well defined just because the situations are so different across infractions, if you will.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Farmer.
As far as the SPED kids, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm going back a few years, but kids, if the disability is in their IEP or 504, they cannot be held accountable for something that relates to that if they do something? An infraction, I don't even know if that's the word, or not, but you hear what I'm saying.
Yep, there's.
Can
sorry.
restorative be used in lieu of?
Yeah, I think, so we can use a restorative approach with, it doesn't have to be disciplinary in nature if we use a restorative approach to, speak with a student, have a conversation, repair harm, build a community. So there's all different ways to use a restorative approach like that. So I think the short answer to your question would be yes.
Thank you.
Ms. Flores.
I have more of a comment than anything. I do recognize this vote tonight is regarding the code of conduct and the business plan itself. I do very much so appreciate in your notes to this evening about the difference between the document and the implementation of the document. The document is a business document. It covers the laws that we are surrounded by and we must implement. I think the implementation provides the humanity. So I just wanted to take the time to say thank you because I know this is an ever-changing process every single time we go into a new school year and we deal with so many different situations with our students. So I know that tonight, I think we have created a really solid code of conduct document to work from, and the implementation itself is something completely different, and I look forward to updates on that. Thank you.
Dr. Herwick.
I also have a comment. I also want to say, I think that this is a really great document. I agree with Mrs. Flores in terms of, the implementation along with all the other things that we're doing. It fits perfect. When you think about some of the other improvements that we're making. But of specific note to me is the student trainings around restorative practices. Because what I would hope would happen with that is not only would they take that training and use it in school, but also out in the community, on the bus, on the playground, as they're coming into contact with conflict in their life. So I'm so glad that we are training them really for the future. So thank you. Kudos to the team.
Yeah, I'll just add one comment on that. So that student leadership piece is part of a larger body of work to just really try to think differently and creatively about how we can address some of these challenges. And so, yes, there'll be a lot more to come on that. Thanks.
Mr. Bonagorio?
Can you provide a little more insight into the mechanisms for bringing more consistency? That was a really big concern shared by a lot of staff members, whether bus drivers, teachers, and a lot of students as well. I know in the past we've had almost a complete range of consequences for the different tiers of violations that encompassed, for a tier 1, for simplicity's sake, from 0 to 30, and then for tier 2 from 0 to 50, and tier 3, 0 to 70, that kind of thing. So what are we doing differently that will provide, are we doing anything that will provide minimal consequences at different thresholds of violations?
So I think I heard maybe a couple questions. The last one I heard was, is there anything that we're doing to provide a minimum consequence for a certain infraction?
Right.
All right. I guess I would just answer by saying, kind of similar to the point that Mrs. Farah brought up earlier, that it's really hard to say for any one specific infraction that we will have a minimum or a maximum consequence, because things are so situation specific. So when administrators are doing an investigation into a certain incident that happened, they're looking at all sorts of things. They're looking at things like, what's the root cause of the behavior? What's the student's behavior history? What's the nature of the disruption? Is there additional safety concerns that were caused by this incident? So it's really hard to say that if incident X happens, we're going to provide this consequence, because they really can be very different. And it's something that we actually unpacked when we met in this room with the committee. We would do a scenario with all the GTA reps and the principals there, and we would give a specific scenario, and the consequences, the appropriate consequences, varied greatly throughout the room. And then once you start to add context, it kind of steers you in one direction as far as an appropriate consequence goes. So it's hard to say, it's just hard to say with kind of overall that there's going to be one minimum consequence to any particular infraction. So to answer the question, what we're doing to help try to mitigate that is, like Dr. Baker said earlier, with the Code of Conduct Committee this year, we're going to be looking at data. We're looking at some trends in the data, use that to come up with some scenarios and go through with the group what would an appropriate consequence be in this case, and try to calibrate responses using the appendix in the Code of Conduct that way.
Can I follow that up?
Sure.
So is that going to be a uniform group that's a consistent group that's involved in all of those situations, or does it vary from building to building?
Well, we'll have a representative group on the Code of Conduct. As far as getting everybody involved, we had a larger group last year than we're going to have this year, but we will have some expectation for those in the group that they would go back to their buildings and bring some of that information back to the schools. And then we also, there's opportunity for implications on our leadership work. So it's really impossible to get everybody that's involved in one room, but we do have communication mechanisms to get the district committee work back into the schools.
Thank you.
I just have a question and, well, it's actually two questions. First, beyond implementation, what else is the code of conduct? Do you have an idea what you're looking at for the coming year yet, or no? Beyond implementation, how that's going?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that we have tentatively planned, and I'll, Dr. Baker can come up and add if I leave anything out. But one is, like she said, to really focus on data, use those quarterly reports to look at the data with the group and see if there is a behavioral trend that we can use as an example of something that we need to address and try to calibrate a response across the team. That's one. Another thing is to really look at trying to promote and really build systems with restorative practices to really kind of use those in combination with traditional discipline practices, so that we can, like I said earlier, just really try to approach things a little bit differently, and kind of respond to the feedback from our Code of Conduct Committee last year and the board with just what exactly are we doing with restorative practices to try to make that a little more well-defined and a little more, I guess, structured across a couple schools. So that's an area of focus as well. And what else? There's something I'm forgetting.
No, I think that's most of it. I think the only other thing is just the online referral and implications of using that, and so using that as a platform just to talk about how that's going and examine some of that. So in terms of having like a certain section, I know we've examined certain things, we're hoping the data will drive us to see if there's a certain area that needs to be examined that's leading to inconsistent implementation. So we're hoping that data is going to drive that versus, and multiple people's perspective on that versus just choosing an area to look at.
Okay. And then my next question is kind of, we've struggled over the years. I don't know if it's reality or it's perception with the implementation. And I've thought about it a lot since we had the presentation last time. Is there, and I mean, I'm going to put you on a spot here for both your thoughts, but is there a positive or a negative to having less people handing out discipline instead of hypothetically 4 or 5 administrators in a building, you reduce down to 2? Would we see more consistency, do you think, moving forward with, instead of so many hands in the pot, fewer hands in the pot, that you guys could work with a smaller group as opposed to the bigger group doing discipline implementation? So we have a better consistency and et cetera. Because it is human. At the end of the day, everybody has their views on different things.
My initial reaction to that is I think it will never be perfectly consistent regardless of who's in there because of all the context. But when we do provide context, I have found that when you leave it so broad of just like what would we do if there was, an incident in the cafeteria with swearing or something, then people want to know, well, what grade level is it? How was there? What led up to that? Was there a conflict? So there's all these contextual variables, and when you layer the context in, that people do become more and more consistent when that's layered in. When it's just like what would happen if there was a verbal altercation in the cafeteria, we are all over the map because you don't have context. So I think when you have layered context to just speak in broad generalities, I think that's where we feel inconsistent because when people are complaining about that, there isn't added context. It's just we speak generally around in the cafeteria, there was a verbal altercation, and somebody got an ISS and somebody got an OSS, or somebody got a slap on the wrist. But if you add in, well, one was an elementary student, and there was bullying involved, and there was all these other layers, then people generally understand, oh, I understand why this was an ISS and this was not. So I think we have to just be mindful of having that context when we're talking about not being consistent, because I actually think it's around general understanding and awareness of why we're making the decisions we're making, so that there's just an increased awareness around why.
Mr. Butler?
So I want to thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the additional response to our last comments that you brought to today's conversation. And one thing that you said I want to underscore, which is the communication challenge associated with it. And one of the things that I have found is about the time that I am sick to death of hearing myself say something is when people actually start to hear me. So I think redoubling your efforts to find maybe new and creative ways to get this information to people so that they understand it better, both how to implement it, but then also how to understand why whatever happened happened. So I just think that the importance of that can't be overstated. So thanks for your work on this.
I want to add one comment too. I also want to be clear because, I mean, this is like almost an impossible task. And I'll give an example of why. During that altercation, as much as context matters, and it's important to sort of dig into that and have an understanding of why one student might get, you know, this consequence and another student gets that consequence. The other layer to this is we can't explain to this student why that student got that consequence. And I can't explain to a family why your child got this consequence and this student over here got a different consequence, because there's a ton around confidentiality related to that. So regardless of how good we are, and I do think we can get better, I think there's a ton of area of growth, and the work that we're doing, I think is hopeful and promising in terms of improving. People aren't satisfied with that. And when they're not satisfied, the narrative becomes, it's just implemented unfairly or whatever it is. So I just think that it's important to realize that within it, there's confines in how we can behave and act with families and with information that we can share that also sort of make it a barrier to helping people really understand and feel like it's being implemented like uniformly for everybody. And then you also take into consideration everybody's beliefs, feelings, and opinions about what should be done, and if it's harsh enough or whatever, which that in itself varies greatly with all families and people, teachers, stakeholders. So it's just a really challenging area. I will also say in 30 years of education, I've never been in a system that's been happy with their code of conduct and how it's been implemented. And I don't say that to be negative, like we can't be better, but it's been, if anybody's been in education, you hear the same things over and over again. I think what I'm proud of in this district is that we continue to listen. We're not ignoring it and saying we're not doing anything. We're being open. We've continued to expand membership and inclusion in terms of that committee. We continue to be clear and open and honest about the work that we're doing to improve. But to Tammy's point earlier, it's humans. So there's always going to be some challenges in terms of the consistency piece on top of all the things I just mentioned. So in short, I appreciate your update. I appreciate you listening to our board and listening to our community and trying to weave those things in. And I look forward to your continued updates this year.
Thanks.
Does anybody else have any quick? Mr. Bonagario?
I want to acknowledge the humanity and the importance of that element of it, and I appreciate the uniqueness of each situation. I also don't want to lose sight of the importance of retaining humanity and respect, and that we always talk about the safe and welcoming learning environment that we want to extend to all of our students as well as our teachers. And I'm concerned about the fact that there are behaviors that happen routinely in classrooms and on buses that would not be tolerated in this room. People would be banned, kicked out of this room during this meeting.
I have less humanity.
I'm sorry?
I have less humanity than some.
Well, and you know, to that point, I think you have your question about narrowing the number of voices and decision makers bears some relevance, because there's a wide range of humanity that goes into those decisions. And it's important that we do try to extend that dignity and humanity to all of our students. I've heard way too many instances of classroom disruption that impair a teacher's ability to share knowledge with our students. And it seems like we go to great lengths to make sure that we protect the interests of those who violate things, but violate the code, but we're not doing enough to protect the students in the classrooms and the teachers in the classrooms. So I'd like to see some mechanisms for just bringing some more definition around consequences and maybe decision-making for the purpose of being able to track and address, if we see things moving in a different direction than we would want, having fewer decision-makers in that context might be better than having to address 18 school principals or however many assistant principals, et cetera. So I'd like to see some means of developing reasonable thresholds to one of the criticisms that I hear often from people who are very strong advocates of restorative practices is the districts are all doing it wrong. They don't apply restorative practices. There's typically the disciplinary piece is missing or is just not well applied. So I think it would be good to move, to put some mechanisms in place in addition to what we've done here.
Anybody else have any questions or comments?
Yes, I just have I have a question. So to Mr. Bonagorio's concern, when you talked about having the system where the principal would put in like whatever the resolution was, and that's something new, so it's going to be electronic, the teachers will have communication. That will also be a data point for us as well, right? So we'll be able to track and know better, how discipline is, what's happening, if there's inconsistencies across the board, and kind of be able to hone in on those things a little bit more specifically. Am I correct in that assessment?
And Dr. Colicchio, jump in if I'm wrong. I don't necessarily think the information in the system is going to change. I think the notification is the mechanism that's going to change the most. So previously the information was entered not by the teacher, and they wouldn't get the follow-up communication that it's been resolved. So I think that the information that's in the system is actually going to be pretty consistent, but their notifications of a resolution, which was definitely something that was a concern, that's going to be addressed by the online system.
The other thing that I would say from a timeliness perspective, as we collect data at those quarterly checkpoints, there could be, because it was a manual system, we weren't always getting accurate data in that there might be some referrals that were not inputted yet. So from a timeliness perspective, we'll have more real-time data in terms of the infection. So yes, to your point, there's some things that will help about that electronic piece.
I'm just gonna say I'm excited about the restorative practices piece and seeing that was the focus you guys did this year, and I'm interested to see how it works, like with the teen courts or whatever we're calling them at Arcadia and the other two schools. I'm really interested in that because I think part of the problem, listening to you guys as opposed to us on the board is we have one view of restorative practice. You guys in education have a different view of what a restorative practice is, what it involves, et cetera. And I think and in my time, this is my 16th year, it's really never been shown to me well. It's been a buzzword all 16 years, restorative practices. But like this is the first time with our various programs we're doing where we're gonna see real, and hopefully we as a board are gonna see real results and real examples of what happened and how it worked. And I think that's been, and I think, and I don't wanna fault myself or any of my colleagues for our misunderstanding the way you guys look at it, but it's just I think we have a little bit different of a perception, and your perception and our perception aren't meeting, so that leads to some of the struggle, I think. So I think moving forward, that was your focus this year is super important to get, for the most part, lay people to understand restorative practices from an educational purpose. And I think that's gonna be really good for us as a board and hopefully the community as well at the end of the day, so we have a better understanding. We still may not understand at the end, but in theory, the hope is we understand it better and we have concrete examples of how it's working in our system and the benefits we're gaining in our system. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? All right, with that, let's do a vote. Thank you both very much. Sorry for everything. What'd you say?
You're very generous.
It probably won't happen again, so enjoy it. Yeah, exactly. So with that, all those in favor? Those opposed? That passes 6-2. Moving on to 9.01, the Comprehensive School Counseling Annual Report. You have it before you. It's written information only. There's a lot of information, a lot of points that you could have looked at online to look at or downloaded. Does anybody have any questions on that? All right. Getting to 12.01, since Mr. Maloney's not here, I'm gonna let the birthday girl take the honors.
Make a motion to end the meeting,
Or adjourn.
or adjourn the meeting.
Is there a second? Seconded by Vice President Moore. All those in favor? That passes 8-0. Thank you, everyone.